We are about to begin. This should be Unit 4. My name is Ellen Zwarnstein, and I get to be your facilitator for this unit. I am the Executive Director of the Michigan Center for Civic Education, where we oversee the We the People program. Your judges are here and thrilled to listen to you in just a few moments. They will introduce themselves. They will ask you to introduce yourselves. And then we will begin with the hearing, and I will hold up the time cards at the appropriate times.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ann Zinkin. I will be your Chief Justice for this session. I am a career law clerk at the New Hampshire Supreme Court. I've been here for about 21 years. I litigated employment cases in San Francisco for about 12 years before that. And I have judged only at the state level for somewhere between 5 and 10 years. This is my first time at nationals, and I'm so excited for our conversation today.
Good morning, I'm Barry Anderson. I'm an Associate Justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court. I'm the Senior Justice on the court. That doesn't really mean anything except that I've just been hanging around for a long time. I have a connection with this program that goes back many years. I've judged at the national competition often. But I also had the experience of being an assistant coach for a team in Hutchinson many, many years ago. So I have some exposure to all the work you've put in, all the preparation, and trying to anticipate what kind of off-the-wall questions you're going to get from judges. We're going to have a great conversation today, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Hank Chambers, law professor here at the University of Richmond. I think I've seen you all somewhere before. So it's going to be a good conversation, and go for it, Green Dragons. Let's see what happens. See what you got.
Morning, we're Maggie Walker of Virginia. I'm Grace Bouton.
I'm Quinn Smith.
I'm Margaret Smith.
I'm Tejas Mikasami. Our coach is Mr. Olmschneider, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to judge for us today.
Well, we're excited to be here. So we are Unit 4, and we are doing question 2. I'm going to read the question, and when I'm done, you should feel free to jump in and start your presentation. Members of Congress are not only legislators, but they are also inquisitorial and should meet frequently to inspect the conduct of the public officers. How effectively do you believe Congress has used its investigatory power? Explain the differences, if any, between Congress's power to investigate and the power of oversight. Which power, in your opinion, is more significant? How effectively do you believe Congress has used its oversight powers?
Congress's oversight and investigatory powers are never explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Rather, they are inherent powers and essential for Congress to effectively fulfill their duties. Both of these powers use the same tools to accomplish their purpose, but the difference lies in jurisdiction. The oversight power refers to Congress supervising federal agencies, and if necessary, conducting hearings to assess these agencies, justified through various laws and House rules like the investigatory, as well as through the McGrain v. Doherty ruling, in which the court upheld investigations are legal and necessary. The investigative power allows government officials to hold the government accountable through said hearings, used in aid of legislative function, as stated in Kilborn v. Thompson, which compel testimony in investigations. However, these powers are not always starkly different. The 1975 Church Committee shows how these powers can blend together through the Senate's investigations of multiple federal intelligence agencies, caused by abuses found through oversight of these agencies.
Congress's use of the investigatory power has become less effective due to hyperpartisanship in the 21st century. To be fair, congressional investigations used to be effective. In 1941, a Senate investigative committee led by then Senator Harry Truman was successful in exposing profiteering within the war effort. This and other 20th century investigations like the aforementioned Church Committee were effective because they had broad bipartisan support. However, the investigatory power becomes far less effective when it has been used for political gain. For example, after the tragedy in Benghazi, Libya, the House opened not 1, not 2, but 6 investigations into the event. Despite the fact that the first 5 yielded no proof of wrongdoing by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Republican-controlled House still opened the House Select Committee on Benghazi in 2014. This had a clear political motive, as then House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy said, quote, "Everyone thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? Her numbers are dropping." As a result, when investigation has a clear partisan motive, it rarely enables Congress to effectively legislate.
Similar to the investigative power, congressional oversight is less effective when motivated by partisanship rather than a desire to improve agency conduct. Review of federal agencies is inherent to the legislative powers of Congress. At its best, oversight serves as a powerful check on the bureaucracy. However, Congress has underutilized this power under unified government. Throughout the Bush administration, questionable government agency and military actions arose without any substantial congressional oversight. The egregious human rights violations committed by US officials and soldiers in the Abu Ghraib prisons should have been uncovered by consistent and aggressive oversight hearings of all military endeavors. Instead, a Republican majority Congress acquiesced to the agenda of a Republican president. The structures to promote oversight are nothing without Congress members to enforce them. Beyond partisanship, Congress has also backed itself into a corner of inefficiency. For example, 108 different committees and subcommittees oversee just the Department of Homeland Security, preventing effective monitoring because of overlapping jurisdictions. Should Congress want to engage in meaningful oversight, the process is now too complicated to do so.
That being said, the Legislative Reorganization Acts of 1946 and 1970 authorized Congress to exercise continual oversight power through standing committees, which expanded its significance. Congressional oversight is able to prevent abuses made by federal agencies, while investigation reacts to misconduct after the fact. For example, Congress can restrict an agency's budget and jurisdiction, as it did with the EPA in the 1980s. In contrast, investigations respond to crises such as the Watergate scandal. Generally, Congress uses its oversight power more regularly than it does its investigatory power. It might use its investigatory power more effectively if Congresspeople were provided a larger and better trained staff to conduct inquiries. For the House specifically, 2/3 of committee funding is allocated to the majority party, even with a majority as small as 51%. This results in investigatory and oversight committees losing valuable staff members along partisan lines, making this key congressional power very difficult to exercise.
Thank you so much. Let me make sure I'm not muted. I'm not. So here's my question. I'm wondering how we measure the effectiveness of congressional investigations. Is it based on how much money is spent, whether the investigation has turned up wrongdoing, whether reforms have come out of the investigation? How would you measure the effectiveness?
I think one of the key ways we can measure effectiveness of congressional investigations is through looking at whether or not it created a greater public awareness. And one example of an investigation that created public awareness is in the 1950s when Congress investigated organized crime. And although this might not have resulted in necessarily legislation or other acts of reform, it did result in a greater public awareness of surrounding organized crime outside of Congress, which was definitely beneficial to the United States as a whole.
And we can also look to how the probe process turns into the investigation process sometimes. So probing is just looking to see if something is wrong, which the Russia probe started out as a probe and then turned into the Mueller report, which really publicized what happened.
And while I would agree with my colleagues, I would disagree partially. I think the most important way to measure the effectiveness of an investigation is to see whether it results in any sort of significant legislation. And I think the money trust investigations of 1912 and 1913 are an excellent example of this because they directly resulted in the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act.
Thank you.
Let me ask this question about the powers of Congress and the executive branch. I think you can make an argument that one of the reasons why we need more oversight, maybe more investigations, is the irrigation of power to the executive branch. What powers, if any, that Congress has ceded to the executive and judicial branch do you think can be recaptured, and how could they go about doing that? Assuming you agree with me that it's a problem, and maybe you don't, and that's a fair response.
I would definitely agree that probably one of the biggest issues facing Congress is the ceding of power. And I think one of those examples is we can see in the budget process, as we've seen starting with President Wilson and continuing on through the 20th and 21st centuries, Congress has by statute given the budgetary power to the executive. That means they're losing their really important power in Article 1, Section 9, that allows Congress to change the appropriations given to certain agencies. And because Congress is defanged in that sort of way, it gives a lot more power to the executive.
I think another example is Morrison v. Olson establishing that only the Attorney General can recommend an independent counsel. I think a way to give this power back to Congress would be allowing Congress to also appoint counsels with limitations, given that they would not be able to indict people in cases when the executive does not take action, to return that a little bit to Congress.
So what happens if Congress investigates and finds criminal wrongdoing? At what point does that trench on the executive's responsibility to enforce the law?
In that case, you might refer the person to a federal or state criminal or civil law enforcement authority. That's why you would have to have certain restrictions on this, because you don't want to take too much power that belongs to the executive. So you would have that power, but just with certain restrictions there.
And in terms of perhaps impeding the executive's ability to do its job, to answer the second part of that question, I think it's important to understand that while the Supreme Court did rule that the executive does have certain amounts of executive privilege in US v. Nixon, that executive privilege is limited. Congress should have the authority, even if it does slightly interfere with the executive branch doing, to find out for the public good what exactly the executive branch is up to.
And I also think it's very important to remember that Congress's investigative power is significantly different than indictment that you would see through an Article 3 court. And so additionally, it's not impeding on the executive's responsibility in the Article 2 take care clause because it's inherently different than indictment.
Okay, let me ask one more question about oversight. At one point, you noted that oversight should be done so that the legislature can supervise the federal agencies. Can you explain what you mean by supervise, to the extent that starts to sound a lot like executive function?
Right. So it's really creating these watchdog committees as sort of a police model to conduct, say, every 10 months, supervise a hearing or create for the EPA to make sure that they're doing what they need to be doing. So we see under the VRA, a hospital was really not more recently, hearings weren't conducted frequently enough. That wasn't cause. So that's why these watchdog committees are necessary.
I'd like to go back to a question that you raised earlier, the hyperpartisanship issue, and you talked a little bit about administrative reform in terms of hiring staff and so forth, and those are all great ideas. I'm just wondering, do you see what mechanisms might be available to drain at least some of that hyperpartisanship away? We're never going to get rid of it completely, obviously, but what could we do?
I think that there are a few smaller provisions that you could make, given Article 1, Section 5, that the House can enact its own rules. And I think the Bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee is a really good example of this, where it seems like there are small changes, but they publish bipartisan reports together, they hold bipartisan press conferences, and that's an example that a lot of House committees could follow.
And I think we could also perhaps follow a model similar to the 9/11 Commission that was formed through congressional statute, where they actually outsourced some of that congressional investigation power to former governors and other political officials. It was also created in a bipartisan way, an equal amount of Democrats and Republicans that would allow both groups the same amount of power to fully investigate without allowing hyperpartisanship to flourish.
So can we have investigations and oversight that's not hyperpartisan in a context where Congress is hyperpartisan?
Possible, but commissions are really the easiest avenue. But we do need to acknowledge that commissions aren't that easy to pass. They need a 2/3 majority to enact those. But that is the most obvious way to decrease hyperpartisanship, even if Congress itself is hyperpartisan.
I would also argue that it heavily depends on the issue. I think we can look to 3 days ago, Congress enacted a new oversight committee reflecting and investigating effect of federal loans on perpetuating fossil fuels and climate change. And this issue is less subject to that really intense hyperpartisan scrutiny, although Congress itself is in a hyperpartisan state.
Oh, you're muted.
That's not helpful, is it? We've got 1 minute. Judge Anderson, do you have another question?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were gonna jump in. That's okay. So you noted changing hyperpartisanism. Is there a way to change outlooks, say, in the context of the military endeavor situation that you all were talking about, in terms of Republicans not wanting to look over the shoulder of Republicans? Is there a way to change that in the military context or in other contexts where, generally speaking, we tend to support the executive branch?
I think we can look towards the base closure process as an example of members of both parties. Instead of looking at what their party interests are, they're looking at their own interests, because no Congress member wants to represent a district where a military base is closing. And so in that regard, they will make the decision that's best for their constituents, as opposed to the hyperpartisan decisions that we see in Congress.
Right, and the base closure process is through Section 8 that really allows monetary fiscalism to play a role in that as well, which obviously the military is a huge part of the American economy.
We've all been assuming here that this is a good thing to have investigative authority by
Ellen's telling us we're out of time.
Ah, shoot.
Takeaway question, perhaps. Yeah.
Oh, well.
You all did a great job. Thank you so much. I'll start out with the feedback. I think you did fantastic. I think that you demonstrated clear command of the material, excellent depth of knowledge. You really shined, in my view, during the question and answer period. I was extremely impressed. I think you knocked it out of the park. Well done.
I agree with the assessment. I was impressed with the level of detail. You know, if you really look to reinvigorating committee processes in the House and Senate, it really starts with staff. And some of your suggestions for improving the staff hiring process, they've been kicking around a while. There have been some white papers prepared by the Heritage Foundation and the Brookings Institute, to name two organizations. And I think you've got some excellent suggestions there, and somebody should listen to you. We'll see if they do. I also think that on this question of power being ceded to the executive and judicial branches, it really is interesting, as U of 11 has observed, that the Congress has become performative, and it needs to recapture its Article 1 powers. And I think you outlined some ways in which they could do that. So good participation, a good depth of knowledge, and no matter what outfield position we came at, you had a response. It was a very strong performance. Thanks very much.
Agreed. Absolutely. Very strong work. Lots of good examples, issues along those lines. Let me just toss out a couple things you may want to consider. You talked about budgeting, but you also mentioned appropriations. Just to note that even if the budgeting authority is given up, that doesn't mean that the appropriations is given up. And of course, impoundment is another piece of the puzzle. So just make sure you're sort of tight on how that works out, because you might get somebody who gets mad at you on that one. Other piece is Morrison versus Olson. Absolutely, it's an old case. It does deal with the question of independent counsel. You may want to consider, because y'all mentioned the Mueller probe. You may want to consider whether the Mueller probe felt at some point as though it was possibly partisan or not partisan. But the other question is whether you want Congress to even get into that area, right? That's the question about whether you're stepping on DOJ's toes. But obviously, lots of depth of knowledge, lots of hard work, as I expect. So good job, and we'll issue you some good luck, and we'll see what happens come later this evening. So y'all take care and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much for judging us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Judges.
Thank you.